Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. In the dream, Wilson found himself standing before a sprawling shoe store, its windows filled with a dazzling array of footwear. His heart had raced with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as he'd pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell chiming overhead to announce his arrival. The store had been a labyrinth of shelves and displays, each one laden with shoes of every style and color imaginable. Wilson had wandered through the aisles, his fingers trailing over soft leather and sleek patent finishes, until he'd found himself in the women's section. There, nestled among rows of stilettos and wedges, he'd spotted them, a pair of black comfort flats, identical to the ones his wife wore. In the dream, he'd picked them up, marveling at their simplicity and elegance. A salesperson had appeared, seemingly out of thin air. "Can I help you find something?" she'd asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Wilson had fumbled for words, his cheeks flushing. I'm looking for a pair of flats. For a Halloween costume?" he'd added hastily, the lie feeling clumsy on his tongue. The clerk had nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Of course. Would you like to try them on?" Before he could protest, she'd ushered him to a nearby chair and slipped the flats onto his feet. They'd fit perfectly, as if they'd been made for him. "How do they feel?" the clerk had asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Good," Wilson had admitted, wiggling his toes inside the soft leather. "Excellent! Now, let's see how they look when you walk." To his horror, the clerk had insisted he stroll around the mall in the flats. In the dream, Wilson had found himself parading through crowded corridors, the click of the shoes on the polished floor seeming to echo unnaturally loud. People had turned to stare, some pointing and whispering behind their hands. He'd felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely exhilarated. Upon returning to the store, flushed and breathless, the clerk had been waiting with an array of other women's shoes. "Let's try these on, shall we?" she'd suggested, her tone leaving no room for argument. What followed had been a whirlwind of lace-up boots, strappy sandals, and gleaming pumps. Wilson had tried on pair after pair, each one fitting as perfectly as the last. The clerk had led him from store to store, insisting he model each new style for an increasingly interested audience of shoppers. Finally, after what had seemed like hours, Wilson had found himself back at the original store, clutching a shopping bag containing the black flats and a pair of women's sneakers. The clerk had rung up his purchase with a wink and a conspiratorial smile. "Sweet dreams," she'd said as he'd left the store, the words following him into wakefulness. Now, sitting up in bed, Wilson rubbed his eyes and glanced at the closet. There, partially hidden behind a row of sensible Oxfords and loafers, sat a shoebox containing a pair of black comfort flats, the very ones from his dream. He'd purchased them a week ago, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite explain. The experience hadn't been nearly as dramatic as in his dream. No parading through the mall or trying on countless pairs of shoes. But he remembered the fleeting look of awkwardness that had passed over the salesperson's face, quickly masked by professional politeness. Wilson swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet hitting the cool hardwood floor. He padded over to the closet and retrieved the shoebox, lifting the lid to reveal the flats nestled inside. They were just as beautiful as he remembered, sleek, black with a subtle sheen to the leather. Glancing at the bedroom door to ensure it was closed, Wilson slipped the flats onto his feet. They fit just as perfectly as they had in the store, hugging his arches and cradling his heels. He stood, taking a few experimental steps across the room. The sensation was exhilarating. The soft tap of the soles against the floor, the way they made him adjust his posture ever so slightly, it all felt wonderfully right. Wilson caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror and paused, studying his reflection. He was wearing flannel pajama bottoms and a worn t-shirt, his hair mussed from sleep. But the flats transformed his appearance, adding an unexpected grace to his stance. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine how he might look in a skirt or a dress, the flats completing the ensemble. A car horn blared outside, startling Wilson out of his reverie. He quickly slipped off the flats and returned them to their box, tucking it back into its hiding place in the closet. As he did so, he wondered how many others had similar secrets tucked away, dreams and desires that influenced their waking lives in ways both subtle and profound. Wilson made his way to the bathroom, his mind still dwelling on the dream and its real-life counterpart. As he brushed his teeth, he couldn't help but wonder about the salesperson who had helped him purchase the flats. Had they sensed his true intentions? Did they have customers like him often? He spat into the sink and rinsed his mouth, then looked at himself in the mirror. The face that stared back at him was the same one he saw every day. A bit tired, perhaps, with the faintest hint of stubble along his jaw. But behind his eyes, there was a spark of something new, a glimmer of excitement and possibility. Wilson showered and dressed for work, choosing a white shirt and charcoal slacks. As he knotted his tie, he found himself imagining how a delicate necklace might feel against his skin instead. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the day ahead. At breakfast, his wife, Emma, noticed his distraction. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked, buttering her toast. "You seem a million miles away." Wilson smiled, hoping it didn't look as forced as it felt. "Just a weird dream," he said. "You know how they can stick with you sometimes." Emma nodded sympathetically. "Want to talk about it?" For a moment, Wilson was tempted to confide in her, to share the exhilarating and terrifying experience of his dream. But fear held him back. Fear of judgment, of misunderstanding, of changing the way she saw him forever. "It's nothing," he said instead, forcing a chuckle. "Just your typical anxiety dream, showing up to work naked, that sort of thing." Emma laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Well, I for one am glad you remembered your clothes this morning," she teased, gesturing at his outfit. Wilson joined in her laughter, but inside a small part of him ached. He loved Emma deeply, but in that moment, the gap between them felt vast and unbridgeable. As he left for work, Wilson's eyes were drawn to Emma's shoe rack by the door. Her black flats sat there, nearly identical to the pair hidden in his closet. He resisted the urge to touch them as he passed, instead hurrying out to his car. The workday passed in a blur of meetings and reports, but Wilson found his mind continually drifting back to his dream and the shoes waiting for him at home. He caught himself absent-mindedly sketching little shoe designs in the margins of his notepad during a particularly dull conference call. When 5 o'clock finally rolled around, Wilson practically flew out of the office. He stopped at a department store on the way home, ostensibly to pick up some new undershirts. But his feet seemed to have a mind of their own, carrying him to the women's shoe department. He browsed the aisles casually, trying to appear as if he were killing time while waiting for someone. His eyes darted from style to style, drinking in the variety of shapes and colors. A pair of red pumps caught his attention, their high heels and pointed toes exuding an air of power and confidence. "Can I help you find anything?" a saleswoman asked, startling Wilson out of his contemplation. He fumbled for a response, his mind racing. I'm just looking for a gift for my wife," he managed to say, the lie coming more easily this time. The saleswoman smiled. "Of course. Do you know her size?" Wilson hesitated for a moment before giving his own shoe size, praying the saleswoman wouldn't notice. She returned moments later with the red pumps in a box. "Would you like to see them?" she asked. Wilson nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. The saleswoman removed the shoes from the box, and he marveled at their beauty up close. The leather was buttery soft, the color rich and vibrant. "They're lovely," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like to purchase them?" the saleswoman asked. Wilson's hand twitched towards his wallet, but common sense prevailed. I think I need to check with her first," he said. "But thank you." He left the store empty-handed, but with his mind full of possibilities. The image of those red pumps stayed with him as he drove home, as vivid as any dream. Emma was working late that evening, so Wilson had the house to himself. After a quick dinner, he found himself drawn inexorably to the closet. He retrieved the shoebox containing his flats and sat on the edge of the bed, turning it over in his hands. With a deep breath, he opened the box and slipped on the shoes. This time, he didn't just stand and take a few steps. He walked around the room, then down the hallway, reveling in the soft click of the soles against the hardwood floors. In the living room, Wilson caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. The incongruity of the feminine shoes with his masculine work attire was stark, yet somehow thrilling. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top few buttons of his shirt, allowing himself to imagine a different version of himself, one who could wear these shoes openly, proudly. Before he knew it, Wilson found himself in Emma's closet. Her clothes hung neatly on hangers, blouses, skirts, dresses in a rainbow of colors and fabrics. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and brushed against a silky blue dress. Heart pounding, Wilson took the dress off its hanger. He held it up against himself, studying his reflection in Emma's mirror. The color complemented his skin tone, and the cut looked like it might just fit him. He hesitated for a long moment, wrestling with himself. This was a line he hadn't crossed before, a boundary he'd never pushed. But the memory of his dream, the exhilaration he'd felt, spurred him on. With trembling hands, Wilson undressed and slipped the dress over his head. It was a bit tight across the shoulders and chest, but otherwise it fit surprisingly well. The fabric felt cool and smooth against his skin, a sensation entirely new and utterly intoxicating. He turned slowly before the mirror, taking in his transformed appearance. The dress hugged his waist and flared out over his hips, creating the illusion of a more feminine silhouette. The flats completed the look perfectly. For a moment, Wilson forgot to breathe. The person staring back at him from the mirror was both familiar and strange. Himself, but a version of himself he'd only ever imagined. He felt a rush of emotions, excitement, fear, shame, and an overwhelming sense of rightness. A car door slammed outside, jolting Wilson back to reality. Panic seized him as he realized Emma must be home early. He scrambled to remove the dress, nearly tearing it in his haste. He shoved it back onto its hanger, praying Emma wouldn't notice it had been disturbed. He had just managed to change back into his own clothes when he heard the front door open. "Wilson!" Emma called. "Are you home? Up here?" he replied, his voice cracking slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Just changing out of my work clothes." Emma appeared in the doorway a moment later, smiling tiredly. "Hey, you," she said, coming over to give him a kiss. "How was your day?" Wilson forced a smile, hoping she couldn't see the tumult of emotions behind his eyes. "Oh, same old," he said. "How about yours?" As Emma launched into a story about her day, Wilson nodded along, only half listening. His mind was still reeling from what had just happened, from how close he'd come to being discovered. That night, as they lay in bed, Emma fell asleep quickly, exhausted from her long day. But Wilson remained awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a chaotic whirl. He thought about his dream, about the shoes hidden in his closet, about the exhilarating and terrifying moment when he'd seen himself in Emma's dress. He thought about the life he was living and the life he sometimes imagined for himself, and wondered if there was any way to bridge the gap between the two. As dawn began to break, Wilson made a decision. He couldn't continue like this, living a double life, hiding such a significant part of himself from the person he loved most. He would talk to Emma, he resolved. Not immediately. He needed time to find the right words, to prepare himself for her reaction. But soon. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Wilson didn't know how Emma would respond, couldn't predict whether this revelation would strengthen their relationship or shatter it entirely. But he knew he had to try. He had to be honest with Emma and with himself. as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Wilson finally drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, he walked confidently through a world where he could be entirely himself without fear or shame. And when he woke, the memory of that freedom stayed with him, a beacon of hope for the future. Over the next few weeks, Wilson found himself paying more attention to women's fashion, not just shoes, but clothing as well. He began to notice the subtle details, the drape of a fabric, the cut of a jacket, the way a particular style accentuated the wearer's features. He found himself admiring not just the clothes themselves, but the confidence and grace with which many women wore them. At the same time, he became more aware of the societal expectations placed on men's fashion, the uniformity of suits and ties, the limited color palette, the emphasis on function over form. It all felt increasingly restrictive. Wilson began to long for the freedom to express himself through his clothing in the way he saw women do every day. He started small, incorporating subtle changes into his wardrobe. A silk pocket square here, a more colorful tie there. He invested in a few pairs of socks with bold patterns, a small act of rebellion hidden beneath his conservative slacks. Each tiny change felt like a step towards authenticity, a quiet affirmation of his true self. One Saturday, while Emma was out with friends, Wilson decided to take a bigger step. He drove to a mall in a neighboring town, where he was less likely to run into anyone he knew. With his heart pounding, he entered a department store and made his way to the women's section. He browsed through the racks, running his fingers over soft knits and sleek silks. He selected a few items, a flowing blouse, a knee-length skirt, a cardigan in a rich burgundy, and headed to the fitting rooms. The attendant gave him a curious look but said nothing as she handed him a number tag. In the privacy of the fitting room, Wilson tried on each item. The blouse draped elegantly over his torso, the fabric cool and light against his skin. The skirt swished around his legs as he turned, the movement both foreign and exhilarating. The cardigan added a touch of warmth and sophistication to the ensemble. He studied himself in the mirror, turning this way and that. The clothes weren't a perfect fit. His broader shoulders and narrower hips meant they hung differently than they would on a woman's body. But even so, seeing himself in these clothes filled Wilson with a sense of rightness he'd never experienced in his usual attire. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine wearing these clothes out in public, strolling down a city street, meeting friends for coffee, even going to work. The fantasy was both thrilling and terrifying. Reality came crashing back as he heard voices in the fitting room next door. Wilson quickly changed back into his own clothes, his hands shaking slightly as he hung the women's items back on their hangers. He left the fitting room in a daze, replacing the clothes on their respective racks. As he did so, he caught sight of his reflection in a nearby mirror. On the surface, he looked the same as always, a middle-aged man in jeans and a polo shirt. But his eyes told a different story, filled with a mixture of longing and resolve. That evening, as he and Emma sat down to dinner, Wilson knew it was time. He couldn't keep this secret any longer, couldn't continue living a life divided against itself. "Emma," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." Emma looked up from her plate, concern etching her features. "What is it, honey? Is everything okay?" Wilson took a deep breath, steeling himself. I don't know how to say this. I've been keeping something from you, something about myself. It's not an affair or anything like that," he added quickly, seeing the flash of worry in her eyes. It's about who I am." He paused, searching for the right words. Emma reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Whatever it is, Wilson, you can tell me," she said softly. "I love you." Her words gave him courage. Slowly, haltingly, Wilson began to explain. He told her about his long-held fascination with women's clothing, about the shoes hidden in his closet, about his recent explorations. He described the sense of rightness he felt when wearing these clothes, the freedom and authenticity he experienced. As he spoke, Wilson watched Emma's face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. He saw surprise, confusion, and something he couldn't quite identify. Was it hurt? Disappointment? Understanding? When he finished, silence fell between them. Wilson held his breath, waiting for Emma's response, terrified that he had just destroyed their marriage, but also feeling an immense sense of relief at finally sharing his truth. After what felt like an eternity, Emma spoke. I don't know what to say, Wilson. This is a lot to take in. Wilson nodded, his throat tight. I know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid. I am afraid. Emma squeezed his hand. Thank you for telling me now, she said. I can't pretend I understand completely or that I know what this means for us moving forward. But I love you, Wilson. That hasn't changed. Tears welled up in Wilson's eyes at her words. I love you too, he managed to say. More than anything. We'll figure this out, Emma said, her voice stronger now. Together. I may need some time to process all of this, and I'm sure I'll have questions. But you're my husband, and I want you to be happy and true to yourself. Wilson felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. There were still many uncertainties ahead, many conversations to be had and decisions to be made. But for the first time in years, he felt truly seen and accepted for who he was. That night, as they lay in bed, Emma turned to Wilson. Can I see them? She asked softly. The shoes, I mean. Wilson nodded, his heart racing as he got up and retrieved the shoebox from its hiding place. He handed it to Emma, watching nervously as she opened it and lifted out the black flats. She examined them closely, running her fingers over the soft leather. Then, to Wilson's surprise, she smiled. They're beautiful, she said, and they look comfortable, too. They are, Wilson admitted. Very comfortable. Emma looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. Would you like to wear them? Now, I mean. Wilson hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He slipped the flats onto his feet, wiggling his toes inside the familiar comfort of the shoes. Emma watched him, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said slowly, I think I have a skirt that might go well with those. Wilson looked at her in amazement. Are you sure? He asked, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Emma nodded, getting up and going to her closet. She returned with a flowing midi skirt in a deep navy blue. Here, she said, holding it out to him. Try it on. With trembling hands, Wilson took the skirt. He slipped it on over his pajama bottoms, adjusting it at his waist. The fabric swished around his legs as he moved, a sensation both foreign and exhilarating. He looked up to see Emma watching him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But she was smiling, a smile full of love and acceptance. You look happy, she said simply. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.